Hello, my name is Rusty Capps. I'm the president and one of the founding partners of Counterterrorism Counterintelligence Training Partners, LLC. In this video, I'll be talking with you about our company, about our instructors, and I'll give you a condensed overview of one of our 4-hour training modules to help you understand what our training looks like. First, about our company. Counterterrorism Counterintelligence Training Partners is a service-disabled, veteran-owned small business. Since 2009, our CTCI instructors have trained thousands of U.S. intelligence community, military, and law enforcement professionals in a wide range of both strategic and tactical counterterrorism and intelligence topics. Initially, our more than 40 off-the-shelf modules were delivered exclusively in person to our public and private sector customers. After the arrival of COVID, however, we began delivering those same classes on the internet. Next, I'd like to talk to you about our instructors. To teach with us here at Counterterrorism Counterintelligence Training Partners, you have to have practical field experience in the professions that we teach. All of our instructors are intelligence, counterterrorism, counterintelligence, or law enforcement veterans who have more than 200 years of cumulative professional experience. Now let me introduce the crown jewels of CTCI Training Partners, our very talented instructor. The first instructor I'd like to talk to you about is Connie Huff. Ms. Huff is a retired U.S. Army intelligence officer who worked on counter-espionage investigations for more than 25 years. She's a graduate of the FBI National Academy and was the senior counterintelligence investigator on an espionage case that convicted an Army soldier of spying for Iraq during Operation Desert Storm. For her role in that espionage case, she was named the Department of Defense Investigator of the Year in 1992. Ms. Huff was later assigned as a senior instructor at the U.S. Army's Advanced Counterintelligence Training Course, where she trained Department of Defense military and civilian special agents in advanced counterintelligence skills. Our next instructor is Gina Bennett. Ms. Bennett is a retired CIA counterterrorism specialist and member of the Senior Analytics Service who served 34 years in the intelligence community. She authored the first warnings in the early 1990s about the growing danger from Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. Ms. Bennett is currently an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's Center for Security Studies and the director of a summer program on intelligence and national security at Georgetown. Our next instructor is Cindy Storr. Ms. Storr was an all-source analyst at the CIA from 1986 to 2007 and was promoted into the Senior Analytical Service in the CIA. Ms. Storr was part of a team that developed and taught the CIA's first terrorism analysis course. She is currently a consultant to the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C., and is an adjunct professor at Johns Hopkins University. Our next instructor is Daniel J. Mulvaney. Mr. Mulvaney is a retired senior officer in the security service of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police who worked several major espionage cases against intelligence officers from the KGB and Eastern European intelligence services. After his retirement from the RCMP, Mr. Mulvaney was the chief of corporate security for 2 Global 500 international oil companies. For the next 18 years, he managed a diverse multinational staff of security managers, investigators, analysts, and technical specialists who provided security and operational support to employees and senior managers who worked and traveled in high-risk international environments. And I am the last of our instructors. From 1965 to 1974, I was an infantry officer. I served in Germany, Korea, and a tour in combat in Vietnam. In 1995, I retired from the FBI as a supervisory special agent after 21 years of service. During that time, I worked a variety of major criminal counterintelligence and counterterrorism investigations. In 1984, I managed the Anti-Terrorist Operations Center for the Los Angeles Olympic Games. I currently teach our counterterrorism and intelligence modules to professionals at a major U.S. intelligence community agency and am a lecturer at Georgetown University in a summer program on intelligence and national security. And now, it's time to give you a first-hand look, as I promised earlier, at our innovative training. To do that, I'm going to take you through an abbreviated running of one of our 4-hour modules. What we're going to do now is look at a condensed version of our training module on domestic terrorism. This particular module is delivered in either 4 or 8 hour segments and covers the following topics. First of all, far-right domestic terrorist groups, including the great-great-grandfather of terrorism in the United States, the Ku Klux Klan. We'll look also at the sovereign citizen movement, the militia movement, the anti-abortion Army of God, and the alt-right. Then we'll change gears a bit, focus on left-wing domestic terrorist groups, look at 2 waves of the anarchist movement that our country has experienced. And then lastly, we're going to look at single-issue terror groups, the Animal Liberation Front, the Earth Liberation Front, and Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty, also known as SHAC. First thing to keep in mind, when you're thinking about terrorism, domestic terrorism in the United States, that it's not new at all. This quote by Jonathan White says it better than anyone else I've seen so far, and that is that domestic terrorism really started early in the colonial period in the United States. It was carried out by settlers attacking Native Americans, by Native Americans attacking settlers, by the British Army, and then later the Continental Army, later the U.S. Army attacking Native Americans in the United States. It included such things as genocide, bioterrorism, the introduction of blankets infected with smallpox virus into the Native American tribes, which I think probably is a bit surprising because bioterrorism is something that we think about as much more recent in its origin. In the Revolutionary War, which also was really our first civil war, because there were 2 major warring sides as well as 2 armies in the field, the irregulars conducted all types of terrorist attacks against folks on the other side. I'm talking about the patriots and the loyalists during that particular war. Tar and feathering is one of the types of terrorism that the colonials perpetrated on those they thought were not loyal to the revolution, were supporting King George and the British side. Later on in our history in the Old West, the law of the West was introduced, and it was vigilante law carried out where almost all of the penalties for everything from stealing horses to murder was hanging. And then it's impossible not to understand the impact of the slave trade and its enduring legacy on violence right up to the present time. The history of slavery in the United States has certainly been a dark period in our time, and we see evidence of that particular event throughout the 400 or so years it has been since the first slaves were introduced into Virginia. All right, important now, I think, to define what domestic terrorism is. For that, we go to the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security. And I'm not going to read this particular detailed definition, which has become increasingly more detailed since I worked domestic terrorism cases in Los Angeles in the late 70s and early 80s. But I think the most important thing to keep in mind is that the difference between international terrorism and domestic terrorism is domestic terrorism has no foreign connection. It is homegrown. It is not sponsored by, motivated by, or actually involved directly with a foreign terrorist group or a foreign state that sponsors terrorism. Right-wing terrorist extremists have a certain set of beliefs that are somewhat uncomfortable to go through, but important to understand, because for us to be successful against them, we've got to be able to get inside their heads and beat them mentally. And to do that, we got to know what they think and what's behind some of their actions. The Christian identity, the patriot movement, all different names for the same group of far-right extremists in the United States. And these are the types of things that they believe or part of their philosophy. First of all, whites, non-Jews are God's chosen race. Jews, Catholics, gays, all non-whites who they term as mud people, they consider to be mentally and physically and spiritually and racially inferior to whites. The federal government, they don't like it all. They see the federal government as the enemy who's stripping away in favor of the groups in the previous bullet their own rights. And I guess we should add one more group to that bullet above, and that would be immigrants. They don't like to pay taxes at all. None of us like to pay taxes, but they are very active in their avoidance of taxes. And they detest all forms of law enforcement, local, state, and federal, with one exception, the county sheriff, because the county sheriff is a holdover from the United Kingdom's sheriff created in common law. Continuation of these beliefs, they'd like to return to and reestablish an earlier status quo that existed during the antebellum South, the South before the Civil War. That's the period they'd like to go back to. They have a real problem, though, and this is good for the country and good for law enforcement. They lack a strong leader. They distrust each other. That's the various groups in the far right, and we'll look at some of them in just a moment. They have divergent philosophical views, and these things ensure that they'll continue to be fragmented. If they were ever able to come together because of their numbers, we think that there's probably 300,000 or so tax resistors. We think that there's as many as 600,000 members of the sovereign citizen movement. And if they were ever to come together under a unified leader, unified charismatic leader, it would be a real problem for the country. Though they are not unified, there's still a danger to society in general and to law enforcement specifically because of those on the fringe of these groups spinning off on their own into small cells or lone wolves carrying out attacks against organizations or against individuals. And I think it's important to know that there's generally that cause this type of violence. First of all, one of these individuals on the fringe will go to a meeting, hear some speaker that will get them ramped up and excited. Then they'll get involved in some sort of mind-altering experience, whether it be alcohol or drugs, and then they'll see something that'll set them off. See a mixed-race couple. See an immigrant in a place where he's not thought or she's not supposed to be. Those three catalysts are at the heart of many of the attacks that we see today. Let's look at how big the problem is, because it's very difficult for agencies, city managers, mayors, people like that, state governors, to allocate resources. They don't know how big the problem is. And we're getting better at, that is, the government is getting better at providing information that shows us the answer to that question. This is a June 2003 look at the location of domestic terrorist attacks in the United States. From 2010 to 2022, there were 47 lethal attacks in the United States that killed 153 people. Now, that's a statistic that has some relevance and some meaning as you look at it. And quite frankly, I have not been able to get these types of numbers until very recently. Here's another look at the size of the problem. This looks at the growth of, or the increase in, domestic terrorism defendants in the justice system from 2010 to 2021. The numbers in 2010 were 123. By July 2021, the numbers were up to 449. This last graph here gives you an indication of the types of domestic terrorism assaults. The largest one of them is racially or ethnically motivated. The second largest is anti-government attacks. That would be the groups like the sovereign citizens, which we'll talk about in just a moment. All right, let's take a look at a recent domestic terrorist attack, a mass shooting, to give you an idea of what these attacks look like, and then we'll break down some of the groups for you. This attack occurred in May of 2022 in Buffalo, New York, outside in the parking lot and then inside the Tops grocery store. in a predominantly black neighborhood in Buffalo. An 18-year-old by the name of Peyton Gendon opened up with AR-15 on anyone he could see in the parking lot and then inside the grocery store, killing 10 and wounding 3. He was wearing body armor. He was wearing a tactical helmet. He had, in addition to the AR-15, he had a pistol and a shotgun. And the camera that was mounted on top of his helmet was streaming live his shooting outside and then inside the Tops Market onto the dark web. He was arrested at the scene, tried, convicted, and sentenced on February the 15th of 2023 to life in prison without parole. I want to look now at the beginnings of the Ku Klux Klan in 1867, as it was really the first organized domestic terrorist group in the United States. It started in Pulaski, Tennessee, by veterans of the Civil War, the Confederate Army, and was in existence really until 1872, when the Union Army, and particularly President Grant and Congress, passed several anti-Klan laws, and it was the first iteration was in fact stamped out. The second coming of the Klan occurred in 1915, lasted until about 1950. This was the Klan at its most successful, the Klan at its largest. By about 1920, there was almost 6 million members of the Klan, and they included state governors, city council people, senators, even one president of the United States, Warren G. Harding, was inducted into the Klan. It started at Stone Mountain, Georgia, and primarily was the outgrowth of one of the first blockbuster silent movies, Birth of a Nation. In any case, it ran into the Internal Revenue Service, couldn't pay its taxes, and pretty much ceased to exist, with only a few thousand members scattered over the United States, principally in the South, by 1950. Then in 1954, the Supreme Court basically changed national law, saying that segregation was now illegal and that integration was the new law of the land, and this spurred the growth of the Third Klan, which included a bunch of World War II veterans that were good at making bombs, and a lot of Klan activity, almost exclusively in the South, began to attack black churches, Jewish businesses, and it went on really till about 1965 or 1966, when the Department of Justice, Attorney General Kennedy, his brother, the President John Kennedy, dying in 1965, but the AG stayed on for a while under President Johnson, then President Johnson's Great Society. All of them combined to basically stamp out the third generation of the Klan, and leaving us with the fourth generation today, which is really a shadow of its former self, primarily because of the growth of a lot of new far-right terrorist groups, principally the militia, but then there are even more recent groups like the Sovereign Citizens Movement, groups like the alt-right, the groups that participated in the January 6th, 2021 assault on the Capitol, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, and the Three Percenters are some of the groups that are taking away from the Klan potential new members that it could have garnered in the modern era. When I was last working counterterrorism cases in the late 1980s, we were looking at about 750 groups nationwide. So this is a very small look at the names of some of the groups that are out there. But these are some of the ones that I would want you to know about. QAnon, not a group, but a movement. Sovereign Citizens, not a group in the sense that the Oath Keepers, the Three Percenters, the Adam Waffen Division, the Aryan Nation, the American Nazi Party, they're all go to a meeting, have a clubhouse, pay dues groups. But QAnon, Sovereign Citizens, the Army of God are movements that don't exist in a physical location, but have a presence on the internet and have adherents, but not folks that go to meetings. In addition to the groups that are out there, there are several events in time that have caused these folks on the far right to coalesce and be angry. And in the case of the siege at Ruby Ridge, the creation of the militia movement, the modern militia movement, grew out of that. What was Ruby Ridge? You should know about that. We'll talk about a couple of other events, Waco and Oklahoma City bombing, the Murrah Federal Building bombing. But Ruby Ridge was an event in time that involved a man that was thought by ATF to be either selling or buying illegal firearms. And so they got a judge to issue a warrant for his arrest. He was told to report to a federal court in Idaho. He never showed up. And so it became a problem for the U.S. Marshal Service. And they mounted an operation. They went out to Ruby Ridge, where his cabin in the woods was located. And a firefight, a U.S. Marshal was killed, as well as Randy Weaver's son, Sandy, and Sandy's dog in the initial firefight. Well, with the death of Deputy U.S. Marshal Deegan, the FBI gets into the case, because when federal law enforcement officers or federal agents are killed, it becomes an FBI case. And the hostage rescue team was sent to Idaho. And they set up a perimeter around Randy Weaver's house, and in an effort to take him out, they accidentally shot and killed his wife. So Randy Weaver's son, his wife, and his dog are dead. A negotiated resolution to the event occurs. Randy Weaver surrenders. He goes to court. He's only given 16 months in jail and becomes a cause celeb for the right wing. And part of what happens as an outgrowth of this particular event at Ruby Ridge is the Rocky Mountain Rendezvous, which occurs the next year in 1993 at Estes Park, Colorado, where a lot of far-right leaders from various groups got together and talked about Ruby Ridge. There was some thought that they were going to come up with a national movement. That never took place. But what did happen was that everyone decided that militias ought to be organized in every state to be prepared for the next one of these attacks by the federal government against them, against citizens. And so that's what happened. The militia movement started. At one point, there were over 800 militias in the United States. Today, I think there probably is less than 200 or 300, but it's a moving target to know how many of these groups that there are. Another one of these events in time that changed so much and motivated so many was the Branch Davidian conflict with ATF over guns that the Branch Davidians were supposed to have, like Randy Weaver, bought illegally. ATF decides to raid the Branch Davidian compound outside Waco. It was February 28th. In 1993, and a whole bunch of 70 ATF agents raided the compound. In the firefight that followed, 16 agents were wounded, 4 were killed, and 6 Davidians were killed. Then the siege began. Again, because federal law enforcement officer is killed or assaulted, the FBI takes over the case. Hostage rescue team sets up a perimeter around the compound. FBI hostage negotiators come in and try to negotiate with David Koresh. He's going to surrender. He's not going to surrender. He's going to surrender. Back and forth they go. After 50 days, because of what was going on in the compound, the Attorney General decided it was time to end the siege. The FBI knocked down a portion of the building, pumped in a riot control agent, tear gas. And because the FBI had already put listening devices into the compound, they could hear and then see the Branch Davidians starting fires. They started 4 fires in part of the compound. The compound burned down. 76 people died. Some were able to get out. It was, according to the Attorney General, a mistake on her part to end the siege. And Timothy McVeigh, who you're going to see in the next slide, was in the crowd watching what happened. And again, like those that were appalled at what happened at Ruby Ridge, he was one of the people that saw the government out of control, attacking American citizens, and that this was a thing that was going to continue to happen. And so he starts planning an attack against ATF that causes him to target the Murrah Federal Building. in Oklahoma City and drives a U-Haul truck into or underneath the portico with 7,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate and fuel oil mixture, an ANFO truck bomb that really obliterated the building. Killed 168, including 19 children, injured 850, and was the third of these events that people on the far right look at as motivation for whatever they're doing by way of organization or whatever they're doing by way of attacking the government or attacking minorities in places in the country. The sovereign citizen movement has been around for perhaps 45 years or so in an organized movement form. They are tax resistors. They believe that they don't owe any taxes or any allegiance or any responsibility to the government of the United States. You can see in this particular graphic places where the majority of the events have taken place: California, the Northeast, in Florida, Tennessee, and North Carolina, those sorts of places. I'm going to show you the event that actually caused me to start noticing the sovereign citizen movement, and we'll talk a little bit about it when it comes back, but it involves the death of two police officers that encountered a father and son, and how that particular situation, that neither the officers nor the father and son were planning for it to happen, actually broke bad for all four of the individuals.
May the 20th, 2010 started out like any other day. Two veterans of our West Memphis, Arkansas Police Department, Bill Evans and Brandon Powdert, were patrolling the interstate as part of the department's drug interdiction team, something they love to do. They became involved in what seemed to be a routine traffic stop, though I've always warned my officers there is no such thing. But really, how much more routine can you get than pulling over a father and son in what looked like a church bus? My men didn't realize who or what they were dealing with. Neither officer made it home. And one of them was my son.
Emergency. Exit 275 on 40. These guys just shot a police officer right on the exit. You said officer's been shot on 270 what? Exit 275 on 40. 275 on 40. Where are you right now? I'm at the exit. They're right in front of me, about 100 feet. Okay, it's a white what? It's a white caravan. A white guy. Please hurry. He's like, oh my God! Oh, shot! Two cops are dead. The other one's in the ditch. They're both dead now. They killed both cops. They shot one, he fell in the ditch. The other one ran behind the car, and they shot him in the hand. All right, where's the suspect now? They just left in a white caravan. They went right up the exit. That guy had an automatic weapon. They're all with automatic weapons. So where are you at now? I'm standing right over the top. All right, what kind of vehicle are you in? Well, I'm in a FedEx truck. You can't miss it. It's huge. Yeah. Tell the cop to come forward. He's coming. There was a white unmarked possible unit that had shots fired. Possibly a white van was going to be the suspect. 615, if you got more traffic, he's right with me.
Jerry and Joe Kane were finally stopped for good after they killed my son and his partner that day, but not before two other courageous officers were injured. We, as law enforcement professionals, face danger every day. We know that's part of our job.
You've looked at that now, and it's a perfect example about how the sovereign citizens or encounters with the sovereign citizens can go bad. If law enforcement does not recognize who they're dealing with, and if the sovereign citizens themselves become agitated or angry at the way they're being treated by a governmental representative that they don't recognize, well, then bad things can certainly happen. Now, these are some of the things you should know about sovereign citizens and the threat that they pose. I said earlier, and I'll say again, they're a loosely organized collection of groups that have adopted this anti-government, anarchist ideology and who practice leaderless resistance. That means that they're not getting direction from above. They do what they do based upon how they feel at the time. They live in the United States. They know they live in the United States, but they believe they're separate or sovereign from all of the authority in the United States. They don't recognize any of the laws, local, state, or federal. And the belief system has generally gained most traction among right-wing, militia, white supremacist, anti-Semitic groups. There are some black sovereign citizens, but it's a very small minority. They see Jews, blacks, minorities, and woke liberals as a threat, immigrants also as a threat to their America, to our America from their point of view. And they can often do become frustrated and violent, as I mentioned a bit earlier, if they encounter a police officer that doesn't recognize their sovereign authority. The next group I want to talk to you about is the militia movement. It really began to grow dramatically in 2007, 2008. Now, this is a group that does conduct training, that does have a clubhouse, that does collect dues. And some of them actually plan and attempt to carry out attacks against the government, against representatives of the government, whether that be local, state, or federal. The growth of this particular group started, as I mentioned, with Ruby Ridge, and then when President Obama was elected, that was a big motivation for additional people to join because there was a feeling among these people that he was going to take their guns away. Other things that impacted the growth of the group is a downturn in the economy, the ever-increasing public and the media focus on immigration, border walls, border issues, and then these rumors of multiple government conspiracies that rise and fall as events take place around the country. There are probably, according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, there are probably about 1,000 groups with 50 new groups organizing each year. And that was in 2008. I think that number is off dramatically. One of the things you may remember that made national news was the standoff with the Bureau of Land Management in Las Vegas by the Bundy family over whether or not they could use federal lands to graze their cattle on. And that gave a spike for a period of time in recruitment. Another part of the far right picture is the anti-abortion terrorists, and principally the Army of God. Now, this is a group that's been extremely deadly. Between 1977 and 2020, there have been 11 murders, 26 attempted murders, and 179 assaults, and you can read the rest of the statistics. The people conducting these lawless acts are not anti-abortion activists in the United States, but rather folks that are on the fringes of that particular group. But in many cases, the anti-abortion activists don't object, or at least don't object strenuously enough to the actions of these folks on the fringes and their attacks on abortion providers and the bombing of abortion clinics and the other types of things that you can see listed on this particular slide. Time to change our focus now to left-wing domestic terrorism, the single-issue groups, and that's where we're going to really look first at how anarchism in America fits into it, and then we'll look at some of the eco-animal rights groups. Anarchism has been around in the United States for a long time. It really came to this country from Europe and the anarchist movement there. It's always been linked, anarchism has always been linked very closely to terrorism. Anarchists believe in the bomb rather than the word. They talk about propaganda by the deed as opposed to carrying signs and so forth. They've been extremely violent over the years. As a matter of fact, no terror group in history has been more effective or more lethal than anarchists. And I say that because you could argue, and I argue, that an anarchist event in Sarajevo with the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, the upcoming leader of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, actually was the catalyst for the beginning of World War I, which killed 13, 15 million people. There have been really two waves of anarchism. The first wave starts as a defensive reaction to the Industrial Revolution and all the ills of the Industrial Revolution. The fact that there was child labor, that conditions were so unsafe in the plants that unions had difficulty organizing, and there was a lot of violence associated with the attempts to organize, the fact that it was so dangerous that the factory owners did not really care much about safety inside the plant. The first wave ends about the 1930s with the beginning of the social welfare state. The second wave comes along starting in the late 1950s as multinational companies began to grow, as economies of the world began to connect one with the other, as we began to see the failings of the welfare state. And then added to those sorts of things, global recession, COVID, massive inflations in more recent times, all add to folks participating in this second wave of anarchism. And you see them mostly when you see G7, G20 meetings of the International World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, that sort of stuff will cause them to come out. Give you some idea of their lethality. In addition to what I mentioned about World War I, they're also responsible for taking out a number of other world leaders, including one president. An anarchist by the name of Leon Czolgosz kills President William McKinley in Buffalo. The president dies several days later, but shoots him in Buffalo in September of 1901, and then the vice president, Teddy Roosevelt, is sworn in as president, and that's how he comes to be the President of the United States. I think important to the history of progressivism in the country at the early part of the 20th century. The deadliest anarchist attack occurred on Wall Street at lunchtime in September of 1920. 40 people are killed, 400 are injured, and it was done by a group of Italian anarchists that were mad that two of their people, Sacco and Vanzetti, another story for another time, were in jail. And so they brought a cart full of explosives and set it off at lunchtime. Caught people leaving their Wall Street offices, walked out onto the street, the cart blew up. Interestingly, this is really the first bombing that was designed to have collateral damage as opposed to make a point or get publicity. In this case, the bombers placed around the explosive inside the horse cart lead window sash weights that are about 3 inches by about an inch in diameter that were used to counterbalance windows so they weren't so hard to push up or pull back down. Anyway, hundreds of them were placed around the bomb, and so when the bomb went off, they became shrapnel and were responsible for so many injuries and so many deaths. That was the most deadly anarchist attack in the United States. The second wave of anarchism really has these groups that you ought to know a little bit about, and we've talked about some of them already. Interestingly, not all anarchist groups are left-wing. QAnon, the alt-right, sovereign citizens movement are all about tearing down government institutions. Anarchists don't like organized stuff. They don't like governments. They don't like national borders. They don't like companies. They don't like multinational companies. They don't like groups like the Boy Scouts or the Red Cross. They like people to live in, men and women to live in an organization-free, a power structure-free society in its most idealistic form. And so there are groups on the left and on the right that fall into that category. I mean, the sovereign citizens don't want there to be a federal government. The alt-right has got a lot of anti-government ideas in it. QAnon, same sort of thing. I want next to talk to you about single-issue domestic terrorist groups. They include the Animal Liberation Front, or ALF, the Earth Liberation Front, and Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty, or SHAC, which really is ALF on steroids. It focuses on a single company, Huntington Life Sciences, that does testing for various pharmaceutical and women's makeup products rather than the companies themselves doing the testing. The first of these terror groups, and it's probably the most prolific terrorist group you never heard about because they don't kill anybody, is the Animal Liberation Front. It began in England in 1976, primarily focusing on stopping fox hunts. It's got cells all over the world, but in the United States, we're looking at maybe 50 to 150 attacks each year. Earth Liberation Front is very similar, but smaller than the Animal Liberation Front. And there is a crossover of people between these two groups. But it focuses, rather than on animals, on the earth itself, on the climate, on things that do damage to the earth, like tree companies, like resorts that take up property that would be better off left to nature. They've got a sense of humor. They really started out working against Boise Cascade and spiking trees. And so a lumberman would come up and use his power saw, his chainsaw on the tree, not see the spike, hit a spike, the chainsaw would explode and just make him angry or actually physically hurt them. These are very bright young people generally that are part of this group. You can see, you've had a chance to read their quote to Boise Cascade here that they left after they destroyed some of their offices in Mammoth, Oregon. You can see that they've got some very bright people that are working with them. SHAC itself grew out of efforts to close down 2 lab animal breeders in the UK. They initially focused on demonstrations, but that didn't work as well as they'd like it to. So then they started focusing on the scientists that worked at Huntington Life, as well as the testing facility itself when they could do some damage to it. One of the trends I think to keep in mind is that the folks that do this ALF and ELF and SHAC sort of terrorism have been doing it for a long time. And although they've had some success, I think their frustration levels are rising to the point where they're starting to do more things that put people in physical danger. We've seen them pay personal visits to the homes of scientists. We've seen them try to blackmail them, engaged in that sort of behavior. They've done fire bombings, usually at times when people were not around, but that potentially is changing as they become more frustrated in their inability to get the desired results. In summary, what we've looked at in the last 25 minutes or so is a summary of the 16 hours of training we have in our modules on domestic, right-wing, and left-wing terrorists. We've looked at the Ku Klux Klan, the sovereign citizen movement, the militia movement, as well as the anti-abortion Army of God, and the kind of modern-day groups inside the alt-right. We've also looked at left-wing domestic terrorist groups, including 2 waves of the anarchist movement in the United States, some of their more significant attacks, as well as the modern inheritor of anarchism, which is Antifa. We finished up with a look at the single-issue terrorist groups, ALF, ELF, and SHAC. The bottom line is that the domestic terrorist movement in the United States continues to evolve. And in our modules, we continue to look for and add new information, new statistics on the size of the problem, as well as our analysis of current attacks in these various categories. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to seeing you again as we discuss some of our other training modules on overviews like this one. Thanks so much.